All right, we are at 11 a.m., so we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Brady. I use pronouns she, her, and hers, and I am the Director of Sexual and Interpersonal Violence Prevention at the State University of New York, and I'm very excited to have all of you with us here today. Before we begin, a few quick notes. Sessions are being recorded and will be distributed to participants afterwards. We do have closed captioning available. You just select the closed captioning option at the bottom of your screen and that'll activate that. And while we are disappointed that we are unable to be with everyone in person, we're hoping that we'll be able to increase participation and create a greater sense of community in a few ways. First of all, there is the question and answer option at the bottom of the screen. Go ahead and submit questions as we move through the session, and your panelists today will make it a point to address them, maybe not all of them, but hopefully most of them. We do have a social media wall. Share your thoughts and experiences as we move through the week using the hashtag SUNY Spectrum for a chance to be featured on the wall. And we have a work group by Facebook group or workspace by Facebook group. And we encourage folks to join and participate and connect with others using that. If you haven't had a chance to join it yet, just send an email to spectrum@suny.edu and we'll go ahead and help you. With that, I'm very excited to introduce my great colleague and a true champion of this work, someone who has been a part of SUNY Spectrum since its inception and has really helped to shape and create the legacy of the conference and what it is today. So with that, I'm excited to hand it over to Dr. Kyan Lynch.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you everyone for joining this morning. My name is Dr. Kyan Lynch. My pronouns are he, him. I am an instructor at the University of Rochester Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. And I am just joyful to be here this morning at the 3rd annual Spectrum Conference. Before I do what I've been explicitly asked to do, I want to just take a moment to express my really sincere and deep gratitude to everyone who is responsible for putting on this year's Spectrum Conference and the last two. And specifically, I would like to single out Elizabeth Brady and Joseph Storch. I imagine it's not a, it's known to all of you the context in which we are having this meeting and how difficult the last several years have been for anyone who has been systematically minoritized and marginalized in our current society and by our current administration. It's sometimes, as a transgender man, felt like a just constant onslaught of negativity and violence and attacks. And there were times where I felt like I couldn't take it all on and I needed to take a break, and where it was hard to see hope. And I would look at the work that Joseph and Elizabeth were doing, whether people were watching or not, whether they were being recognized for it or not. And they are just relentless in their pursuit of equity for all. And I think that they are just the truest form of allies that the trans community could have. And I'm very grateful for their partnership and continued work. So thank you very much, Elizabeth and Joe. And now I am very excited to introduce our speaker this morning. Taylin Stolting, who's empowering trans survivors of child sexual abuse. Before I turn it over to Taylin, I'd like to give you a little bit more information about their background and accomplishments. Taylin Stolting is a queer and trans survivor and has worked in the field of gender-based violence prevention and advocacy for over 5 years through research, community organizing, and education, with a particular focus on working with transgender survivors. As the Enough is Enough coordinator at Kingsbridge Heights Community Center in the Bronx, they work with 12 colleges and universities across the Bronx and Manhattan to support gender-based violence prevention and response efforts. They are also a circle keeper for Hidden Water, which uses a restorative justice approach to break the cycle of childhood sexual abuse and transform harm into shared healing. Talon approaches their work with a commitment to anti-oppression, gender liberation, and racial justice. Talon received their BA in Women's and Gender Studies from Bucknell University and their MSW with a certificate in practice from Simmons University. And now I'm honored to turn it over to Talon Stolting.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here today. I certainly wish we could have been in person so that this could be more of a conversation and an exchange. But of course, with the realities of COVID, that wasn't possible. And like Elizabeth said, a huge benefit of being digital is how much more accessible this is for people who may not have been able to travel to New York otherwise. And for that, I'm really grateful. But at the same time, a huge disadvantage is that not everyone has the same platform to share their thoughts and ask questions. If I was presenting in person, it could be a conversation, it could be more of a dialogue. And there'd be opportunities for people to publicly contribute and ask questions, to call me out if I misspeak, because I really want to highlight that I am speaking from my own experiences, both personally and professionally, and that even as a queer and trans survivor of both childhood sexual abuse and sexual violence as an adult, I still hold immense privilege as a white person, as someone from relative degree of class privilege, as someone who's had access to formal education. So my voice is by no means the end-all be-all when it comes to these conversations. And while I'm grateful for an opportunity to share what I've learned, I wish we could be in person so that others could also share what they've learned and their experiences as well. So this workshop has really been born of my own experiences as a trans survivor of child sexual abuse and as a professional working in the field of gender-based violence and prevention and advocacy, and really seeing how the intersections of child sexual abuse and transness is something that on the whole, our field is vastly ill-equipped to confront, both in terms of prevention and direct services. I really encourage questions. I'm gonna save them all until the end. I'm gonna get to as many as I can. Any that I don't get to, I'll have my email up. So I really encourage you to reach out and continue the conversation afterwards. And sort of a last quick note before we sort of dive into the material. I think the title and description of the workshop kind of alone may serve as a trigger warning, but just to be explicitly clear, we are gonna be talking about some heavy stuff today. So please do whatever it is you need to do to take care of yourself. Like Elizabeth said, this is being recorded. So if you need to step away, you can always come back to it at a later time when you have more bandwidth to do so. So just kind of a quick overview of what we're gonna be talking about today. We'll start with some Zoom polls just to kind of get a sense of where folks are at. This workshop is mostly geared towards people who already have a basic understanding of the trans community, but I still want people without that knowledge to get something out of it. So I will do a very sort of quick and very brief Trans 101. If in the Zoom polls, it seems like a lot of folks don't have that basic understanding, I'll definitely spend a little bit more time on this to make sure that we all are sort of on the same page. And I think even though a lot of us work in sexual violence prevention and advocacy, I think even in that field, there's still a lot of misconceptions and sort of different ideas of what we actually mean by child sexual abuse. So I also want to sort of get us on the same page with that. So we're going to sort of talk about that broadly as well before we really dive into what sexual violence in the trans community and what child sexual abuse in the trans community looks like. And then we'll end with some practical tips of working with trans CSA survivors, and then also have some references and resources. I'll work with the folks at SUNY to make sure that these slides are available to you afterwards, so that way you can have access to those things. So I'll go ahead and ask Elizabeth to launch the polls. Wonderful timing on that. So the first one, I feel confident working with adult survivors of child sexual abuse. And with that, I really want to distinguish that there is a difference between working with an adult who's experienced these things in the past and working with a child or an adolescent who may still be going through it or has more recently gone through it. And then I'm knowledgeable about the trans community, and finally, I feel confident working with trans survivors of sexual violence, and that can be sort of interpreted however you like across the lifespan. Let's see, I think I may have to submit the answers to see the responses, so I'm gonna do that real quick. Let's see. I'm assuming they'll pop up. I'm not seeing them. So if you have any words of wisdom, Elizabeth, that would be useful. I'm imagining you may have to like close it or whatever. Ah, there they are. Amazing. I sometimes talk when I'm nervous, so you will probably pick up on that. Cool. So it looks like we have a lot of agrees for the first one, kind of all over the place with working with children and adolescents, which I kind of anticipated because I know we have a lot of folks from higher education who may not have experience working with children and adolescents. Most people seem like they have a solid base about the trans community, so I will kind of move through that portion fairly quickly, but I do want to reach those few folks who said strongly disagree or neutral. And then, okay, awesome. So we do have kind of a solid understanding so far, but definitely room for improvement. And I think that's something we all in the field need to be aware of, that there's always going to be room for improvement. So Trans 101. Where I always like to start with Trans 101s is just talking about the difference between sex, gender, and sexuality. I won't go into detail about sexuality now, but the very oversimplified way I like to explain it to folks is that sex is what's in your pants, gender is what pants you wear, and sexuality is whose pants you want to get into. That misses a lot of nuances and sort of the complexity of these things, but I think it's a useful sort of like fun, quippy starting point to at least get a very basic understanding of what these differences are. So sex really refers to the biological and physiological characteristics that relate to reproduction. And this can be through primary or secondary sex characteristics. And then intersex is a term that you'll often sort of see when talking about sex and gender, and intersex refers to when a person's sex characteristics are not distinctly male or female. And there are a lot of different ways that this can show up. And if that's not something you know a whole lot about, I really encourage you to go sort of do some of your own research. There are a lot of great articles and books and videos on YouTube and things like that to help educate you on that topic. And then finally, gender. I have an entire bachelor's degree and master's degree in gender studies. So it's hard to define it very succinctly, but the very quick definition I like to give is that gender is really about these socially constructed conceptions of masculinity, femininity, both or neither. And it consists both of gender identity, which is really that internal sense of how someone identifies, and gender expression, which is how someone expresses that gender to the world. And gender identity and gender expression don't always align, but they can. And that alignment may be because of personal preference, it may be because of safety issues, or maybe issues with access to clothing and accessories and things like that that are affirming to one's gender. So there are a lot of sort of different aspects of that. And again, this is a very quick overview. I really like this graphic to highlight that when we're talking about all these things, gender identity, gender expression, sexuality, things like that, they exist on a spectrum, but not a spectrum of masculinity at one end and femininity on the other end. All of these things exist simultaneously. So you may have certain feminine traits about you, and you may also have some masculine traits that you like to show. And those two things don't cancel each other out. They exist simultaneously. And I think this graphic does a good job of highlighting that. I also have tea. So apologies for any breaks that I take to hydrate. Also, some quick terminology. What I really want to focus on here is the term cisgender. So cisgender basically refers to someone whose gender identity matches what they were assigned at birth. And a lot of times people's response when they hear this term is, oh, so the quote normal gender. We really want to stay away from words like normal, because that implies that being transgender is abnormal. And that is not a narrative that we want to uplift, because it is perfectly normal and perfectly natural to be transgender. Gender nonconforming, something I want to highlight about that is that not everyone who's gender nonconforming is trans, and not everyone who is trans is gender nonconforming. So you may have a cisgender woman who dresses very masculinely, and so she might sort of fall under it or identify with this umbrella term of gender nonconforming, but she's still a cisgender woman. And you may have a trans woman, for example, who adheres to sort of traditional ideas of femininity and may not identify with gender nonconforming. So that's all to say, it may be part of the trans community and it may not be. They're not one and the same, but it's still a useful term to be aware of. And also gender non-binary. So someone who sort of falls outside traditional binaries of gender. And so these terms, I debated a lot whether or not I want to include them, but I think the first four, AFAB, AMAB, transmasculine, and transfeminine, are useful in defining these next few terms that I think are going to be important as we begin to talk about violence. So AFAB is assigned female at birth, and AMAB is assigned male at birth. And then transmasculine is an umbrella term used to describe AFAB people who identify with masculinity more so than femininity. So this may be trans men, this may be genderqueer folks who sort of fall on that spectrum of transmasculinity. There are a lot of different identities that may fall within that umbrella. And similarly, transfeminine is an umbrella term to describe AMAB people who identify with femininity more so than masculinity. And these are important to understand that to help us understand what we mean by the cis patriarchy. And so the cis patriarchy is really about the interlocking power dynamics that privileges cisness over transness and masculinity and manhood or femininity and womanhood. And this leads to cis sexism, which is acts of violence that are influenced by the cis patriarchy. Excuse me. And so this is to really highlight, and also transmisogyny, it's a term coined by Julia Serrano to describe the unique form of cis sexism, that is a tongue twister, and misogyny that trans feminine people experience. So these cis patriarchy, cis sexism, and transmisogyny are really important terms to help highlight that even though all trans people experience transphobia, it's not going to be the same universally. How we present, how the world perceives us, and how our identity adheres to or not adheres to ideals that the cis patriarchy creates is going to influence how we experience that transphobia and our overall life experiences. Just a few quick notes: not all trans people medically transition, and it's never okay to ask a trans person about their medical transition unless you're in a medical setting where it is medically necessary. And also it's important to mirror the language that individuals use to describe themselves. I gave some very quick umbrella terms and umbrella definitions, but not everyone is going to necessarily agree with those definitions or agree with the labels and things like that. They may use different labels to describe themselves, and that's totally okay. It's really about listening to trans people and what language they want to use for themselves. And also gender neutral language. This is going to be important as we sort of move later in the presentation, but it's really useful when you're speaking broadly or if you don't know someone's gender. So like if you're presenting at a workshop and you in person, whenever that happens again, and you want to call on someone who you don't know their name, instead of saying, oh, the woman in the second row, just say the person in the second row, because you don't know their name, you don't know their gender, you don't want to make those assumptions. But at the same time, you don't want to use gender neutral language in a way that is ignoring the experiences of gender or the power dynamics of cis sexism. Now make a little bit more sense, I think, as we get later in the presentation and really talk about what prevention looks like when we're talking about child sexual abuse, particularly in the trans community. So what is child sexual abuse? Oftentimes when people hear child sexual abuse, they automatically think that it is sexual abuse that is perpetrated by a family member and it's repeated, it's ongoing. And while that is absolutely a part of child sexual abuse, it is by no means the only way that it manifests. So there are going to be different legal definitions state to state. There are going to be different scholarly definitions depending on researcher. Different agencies even have different sort of definitions and criteria for what falls under that category. I personally, and for the context of this presentation, use a very broad definition of child sexual abuse, which is any form of sexual harm that occurs before one is at a developmental age of being able to consent. Generally, that happens in the late teens. And I don't mean necessarily legal age to consent, because that varies from state to state. And also, it's not always that cut and dry. There may be some 16-year-olds who are at a place of being able to consent, and there are other 16-year-olds who may not be, and that is totally fine. So I like this definition because it allows for that kind of nuance. And other reasons why I really like this definition is that it increases access for survivors, and that I think is probably the most important reason to keep these definitions broad. I have sat in so many survivor spaces for survivors of child sexual abuse and heard so many people So many survivors say things to the effect of, I never thought I could get help because I was a teenager and not a child. It wasn't a family member who was causing the harm. It only happened one time and it wasn't ongoing. So even if agencies and organizations aren't doing the gatekeeping about what counts as child sexual abuse, survivors can often sort of self-impose these arbitrary definitions that make it difficult to access services. So I think being explicitly clear about these broad definitions is really useful. And I also like this definition because it focuses on the impact and the harm caused rather than getting caught up in any type of legalese or scholarly definition. Many people, for example, may see a 16-year-old getting raped by another 16-year-old not a form of child sexual abuse because there's not the power dynamics around age, but that doesn't mean the lasting impact isn't going to be similar to other experiences of child sexual abuse, especially when you look at their neurobiology of trauma. Experiencing trauma while you're still developing has a much different impact on someone than a trauma that occurs after one has finished developing and their brain developing. That doesn't lessen the impact that happens in adulthood and after we finish developing, but it changes how we can often approach it in a therapeutic setting. But with that said, age often does play an important role in child sexual abuse because there are so many power dynamics at play. So for example, two 16-year-olds in a consensual relationship, most people would probably say that's fine as long as they are able to navigate consent in a responsible way, then yeah, they can have a consensual sexual relationship. A 16-year-old and a 30-year-old, for example, that starts to get really questionable because of those power dynamics that come with age. And that brings me to the next point of self-identification. So there are many teenagers who may be in a relationship with someone, an adult who is notably older than them, like a 16-year-old and a 30-year-old. And they may not see that as a problem. They may never see that as a problem. And it is not our job as service providers or whatever your role may be to sort of tell you, oh no, what you experience is child sexual abuse. That's not what we want to do. It's really about empowering them to have agency over their body, to help them understand the role of power dynamics in all their forms, not just age, so that when they're navigating consent, they can do that in a responsible and respectful way that honors not only their own body and well-being, but also their partner's body and well-being. And also educating them about the wide spectrum of healthy and unhealthy intimate relationships so that they can make informed decisions as they move about their life. Also with this definition, I want to be very clear that I'm including forms of cybersexual abuse in this definition. So that can be things like revenge porn, threats, involuntary exposure to pornographic materials, child pornography, things like that. Oftentimes I think people kind of separate out child sexual abuse and things like child pornography. And I think there are very important sort of legal differentiations that happen there. But for the purpose of this presentation and for the purpose of providing services, again, we're really focused on the impact and the harm caused. So I think including all of them in this umbrella definition is really useful. And it also includes a whole wide range of acts. It's not just sort of penetrative rape like we often think about when we're talking about child sexual abuse. It can include verbal harassment, exposure to a sexual act, forced masturbation, fondling, et cetera, et cetera. And when I say a spectrum of violence, I do not mean that harm or trauma on one end of the spectrum is inherently worse than violence or trauma on the other end of the spectrum. What I mean is it's how recognizable that violence is to society at large. So pretty much everyone in society can sort of say that raping a child is wrong. That is pretty widely known. It gets a little bit grayer for some folks when you start talking about verbal sexual harassment of a minor. So really focusing on, it's not saying one is worse than the other because that can really negate people's experiences who are traumatized by things at this sort of, quote, lesser end of the spectrum. It's about recognizing that we as society have sort of labeled these things as worse or less severe, but that's not reflective of the impact that it's having. When we're talking about child sexual abuse, I also think it's important to talk about the realities of stranger danger and sort of the myths of that. So often when we're children, we're taught about stranger danger. I've heard many parents sort of implement code words and things like that. So if a strangers picking their child up, this person will know a specific code word to tell the child to know that they are a safe adult, and things like that. And while those things are absolutely part of prevention and child sexual abuse prevention, it's not the only type of prevention we need to do. Strangers do perpetrate violence against children, so we should be taking those preventative measures. And we need to acknowledge that the vast majority of child sexual abuse and other forms of violence against children is perpetrated by people known to the family. I believe the statistic is about 90% of child sexual abuse is perpetrated by someone that is known to the child. It's not always family members. It may be doctors, religious leaders, neighbors, family friends, etc., but it certainly can be family members as well. But all of that is focused on this sense of familial trust that is built. So parents build up a trust and relationship with these people and say, I trust you as a person, so I'm going to trust you with my child. And these people use that as part of the grooming process to sort of target and exploit these young people. And that's why we have to talk to children and young people in developmentally appropriate ways about their bodies, what a good touch and what a bad touch is. So that way they know how to trust their gut and know when something isn't right. But also we can't stop there with prevention because we can't be placing that kind of responsibility on our children to identify and speak out against child sexual abuse. And I'll talk more about prevention later on. And finally, last point on this side is cycle of violence. We often hear that child sexual abuse is a cycle of violence. And in some ways that is a useful sort of imagery to create because it helps people understand that there are patterns that exist within sexual abuse. What ends up being harmful about this is there's this widespread belief that those who experience childhood trauma grow up to be abusers themselves. And it is true that many people who perpetrate child sexual abuse are child sexual abuse survivors themselves, but that does not mean everyone who experiences CSA will grow up to become an abuser. And this narrative is really harmful because it has a tendency to vilify survivors, particularly cisgender men and trans feminine folks, by labeling them as abusers without any cause, instead of creating compassion for those who cause harm. And I personally believe that compassion and humanizing those who cause harm, even harm as deep and violent as child sexual abuse, is the only way we can prevent such harm. That is very much coming from a restorative justice framework. And I'll sort of talk a little bit more about that throughout the presentation. But another challenge with this narrative is that so many people end up just thinking that, oh, if we just lock everyone up who inflicts this kind of violence, then the cycle of abuse will stop and we'll be good to go. We are done with it. Well, one, that ignores all the problems with the criminal legal system, which I think are incredibly apparent in the current state of our country. Inherently racist, it is built upon racism, very ableist, et cetera, et cetera. And also that sort of mentality overlooks forms of child sexual abuse that don't necessarily fit within legal definitions. So you really aren't preventing anything. It creates a very reductive narrative of what child sexual abuse is, who the people are that are causing harm, and it's really not doing anything to prevent it. It's putting a Band-Aid on a very particular type of harm and ignoring all the rest of it. And so in the past couple of years, I've started doing a lot of restorative justice work within the context of child sexual abuse. I'm by no means an expert. I'm still very much in the sort of learning and growth phase around RJ. But what that journey has taught me so far is that anytime we talk about violence in this sort of reductive, cyclical way without nuance, or anytime we dehumanize people who cause harm, we're really just creating more harm and violence. So within the context of child sexual abuse, I think it's really important that we move away from that narrative to understand it more holistically, and understand it from this framework of power dynamics and systems of oppression that can help us really get at the root causes and really begin to build prevention frameworks that are more than the superficial Band-Aid. So real quick, most of the research that exists on child sexual abuse is focused on cisgender people. An estimated 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys experience sexual abuse before the age of 18. These numbers are likely underreported because there's so much stigma around child sexual abuse and so many challenges in doing this kind of research. Those in marginalized communities face higher rates of child sexual abuse. So those with disabilities, children of color, LGBTQ folks. And what I really want to highlight, and I'll probably say different effects of this throughout the presentation, being part of these communities is not a risk factor. It is these systems of oppression that are creating vulnerability. Our identities are not a risk factor. Transphobia is, racism is, sexism is, et cetera, et cetera. As we're looking at the impact of child sexual abuse, many of these sort of impacts are going to look very similar for any type of trauma across the lifespan. So PTSD, suicidality, eating disorders, depression, anxiety, medical complications, substance use disorders, memory loss. All these things are true across the lifespan. But what I really want to focus on are these neurological and epigenetic changes. I am not a science person, so this is very much sort of my layman's understanding of these things, but I really encourage you to sort of look into some of this research if you enjoy reading about it like I do. But so epigenetics is basically refers to what genes that we hold in our bodies, which ones are turned on or off as a result of environmental factors. So an example that I read somewhere is that, you know, someone may have the genes to be really tall and built and fit, but if they're malnourished in an environment that isn't allowing those genes to come through, then those genes aren't going to show. They're going to be sort of turned off. So the environment we grow up in is real, and the experiences we have really affect our epigenetics and our sort of subsequent outcomes in life, both physical and mental well-being. And so trauma at a developmental age can really affect those neurological and epigenetic changes and have lasting impacts in a unique way compared to trauma that occurs in adulthood. And again, I encourage you to look more into it. I am not a biology person or neuroscience person, but I think it's important to recognize that those changes absolutely do exist and play a significant factor in how we need to address childhood trauma. I'm not going to go into a ton of depth about sort of red flags, because that's not necessarily the point of this presentation, but I felt it was important to include because we are talking about child sexual abuse and not everyone knows these red flags, even people who may work in sexual violence prevention or advocacy. This list is by no means exhaustive, and by no means do I mean that anyone who experiences any of these symptoms is being sexually abused, and it does not mean that anyone who's being sexually abused is going to show these signs necessarily. So any type of sudden behavioral changes, avoidance of certain people or places, bedwetting that is sort of suddenly onset after potty training or challenges with potty training, frequent UTIs, nightmares, psychosomatic complaints, itching, pain, or discomfort in genitals are all potential red flags. But I think the most important one that often gets overlooked is listening and believing children. I think so often parents and teachers and other sort of adults in young people's lives assume that a child doesn't know what they're talking about, that they're just making something up or they're playing pretend or whatever. But if a child is telling us something is wrong, we as adults need to be listening to that and making sure that they are getting the support and that they need and deserve. So I have some of these images throughout just as a reminder for myself to breathe and also sort of center myself, and also hopefully a reminder to some of you, because we are talking about heavy things. Child sexual abuse is not an easy thing to talk about. So I hope some of you get some joy out of that. I'm not saying that these are going to necessarily fix the heaviness of this or resolve it, but it is a moment. So sexual violence in the trans community. Basically, there's not a ton of research on sort of sexual violence across the lifespan in the trans community. That the research that does exist most often does not ask anything about age, so we don't know when exactly sexual violence is occurring. We don't know the frequency of it from most of these studies. But from the studies that do exist, the sort of average percentage approximately that keeps coming up in various studies, I have 3 listed here, but there are a handful of others out there as well, is approximately 50%. This James et al. 2016, that is the US Trans Discrimination Survey, which was, the data was gathered in 2015. And that had over about 28,000 responses. So huge data pool that we're looking at, and also approximately 50%, which is a devastatingly high number and a really harsh reality to confront. Many studies that do look at sexual violence in the trans community is specifically asking about violence that is targeted because someone is transgender. So I'm going to use myself as an example here. A lot of the abuse I experienced as a child happened before I came out. I did not come out as trans until adulthood. So if I was to be filling out one of these surveys and asked, did you experience child sexual abuse or sexual violence in general because you were trans, I would probably put no for that, because the violence that I've experienced was not targeted specifically because of that. So that is to say that these numbers are probably a lot higher because of that. It is incredibly useful and important to understand specifically anti-trans targeted violence and sort of understand how rampant transphobia and cissexism is, but it's not capturing a full picture. And also, a lot of these studies, while they do a great job of trying to reach homeless trans folks, for example, in general, getting reliable data from those experienced homelessness is really challenging. And so we're missing some of the most marginalized parts of the trans community with a lot of these research studies, because we're not able to reach that population as well as we can those experiencing financial stability or more financial stability. So again, that is another factor that sort of tells us that chances are these numbers are probably higher than what the studies are actually showing. And also, like all forms of sexual violence, the rates are higher for Black, Indigenous people of color, and disabled trans folks. So why are the rates so high? I hope this is obvious to many of you. It's systems of oppression. That is really at the core of why these rates are so high. More specifically, poverty can play a very significant role. In general, those experiencing poverty or financial instability are more vulnerable to sexual violence, and trans people face more poverty than the general population. The U.S. Trans Discrimination Survey found that trans people are about 3 times more likely than the general population to be below the federal poverty line. And also, when trans folks are experiencing financial insecurity and poverty and homelessness, there is a high portion of those folks who go into survival sex work. And that is an absolutely valid choice, and oftentimes the only choice that folks have. And sex work, because sex work is criminalized in the United States, in general, sex workers are more vulnerable to experience violence. That is not because they're sex workers, but because people are choosing to use the stigma and criminalization of sex work as an excuse for violence. And so when people engage in survival sex work, there also might be greater risk because they may be choosing between food or a place to sleep and engaging in a sexual activity that they may not want to engage in, which is in and of itself a form of sexual violence. And just in case folks are familiar with the term survival sex work is kind of what it sounds like when people engage in sex work because they have no other means of financial income or no other way to get a place to sleep at night, etc. So it's done out of need for survival and not necessarily choice. And if you're interested in looking more into that, the Sex Workers Project in New York City is a really great resource. They do some phenomenal trainings around sex workers' rights and things like that. Hate crimes are also a huge factor. So that is when people target a trans person because they are trans for violence and sexual violence. Corrective rape is a term that originated in South Africa in response to these extremely high rates that specifically Black, lesbian, and bisexual women there were and still are experiencing. And so this form of sexual violence is perpetrated by people who want to, quote, make them straight. So it's a really horrific form of targeted violence based on one's sexuality. This term has sort of spread beyond South Africa and is used now across the world. There have also been sort of increasing instances of trans people who are being targeted for corrective rape as well. And a lot of that ties into sort of this confusion about the differences between being trans and being lesbian, gay, bisexual, and sort of that confusion of gender and sexuality. There are also very specific targeted power and control tactics that folks use to perpetrate violence against trans folks. So a lot of times you may hear power control in the context of intimate partner violence. And as I imagine all of you know, intimate partner violence and sexual violence are two separate forms of violence that can and often do overlap. So power and control tactics can often happen in intimate partner relationships, but they can also happen in other forms of relationships. So a boss and an employee, a teacher and a student, et cetera, et cetera. So what that may look like is it may be threatening to out a trans person as trans if they don't have sex with someone, or threatening to obstruct someone's transition. So withholding medication or hormones, withholding health insurance if they don't engage in sex. Also saying things like, this is how real men and women have sex, and things like that, or forcing a trans person to do a specific sexual activity that they aren't comfortable with. And it can also be exploiting gender dysphoria. So gender dysphoria is very short answer of what it is. It's the discomfort that many trans people feel with their physical bodies because it is incongruent with how they identify. Not all trans people experience gender dysphoria, but many do. And so, for example, if a trans man has not had top surgery and has a lot of gender dysphoria around his chest, he may not want his chest touched when having sex with a partner. And so he may make that clear to a partner, I don't want you to touch my chest. But if a partner is very intentionally not listening to that boundary and exploiting the gender dysphoria that he's experiencing, then that is absolutely a form of violence and sort of falls in this category of targeted power and control tactics. And finally, another sort of reason, family rejection. So the US Trans Discrimination Survey of trans people who were out to their immediate family that they grew up with, 50% had at least one experience of a family member rejecting them. And what that study also found is that being accepted by your family significantly increases overall health and well-being, and you experience less violence when your family accepts you. So having that supportive environment is incredibly important. So being rejected by your family can put you in a really precarious situation that often intersects with these other forms of violence. So that can tie back into a lot with poverty and violence, because being rejected by your family leads to incredibly high rates of homelessness for trans folks, and high rates of poverty. So these are just a few sort of examples of why the rates of sexual violence in the trans community is so high. And what I really, really want to highlight here is that sexual violence does not cause someone to be trans or queer. That is a really harmful narrative that I have seen more times than I would like to count. If I had $1 for every time I heard something to that effect, I could probably pay off my student loans. Is not true. If sexual violence, particularly childhood sexual violence, caused someone to be queer or trans, then there would be a lot more queer and trans people in the world. But the reality is that there are plenty of child sexual abuse survivors who are not queer or trans. And while trans people do experience very high rates of child sexual abuse, not all queer and trans people do experience child sexual abuse or sexual violence in general. So that is a really important narrative that I want to drive home, that sexual violence does not cause someone to become queer or trans. So moving into trans erasure and sexual violence. I like to sort of think of it in these 4 different levels of awareness, prevention, education, direct services, and research. So on the awareness level, the Me Too movement, really prevalent in the past couple of years. The way it's been portrayed by mainstream media is incredibly focused on cisgender women. And Tarana Burke and other leaders in the Me Too movement have spoken out about the importance of including trans people and trans voices in the Me Too movement. But so many times it just did not stick with mainstream media. I myself have been criticized, and I've seen many other trans people be criticized for speaking out about this erasure in the Me Too movement and sort of awareness in general, because people say that us speaking out about our experiences with sexual violence is erasing the experience of cisgender women's experience. And because there are more cisgender women by pure numbers who experience sexual violence, just because there are more cisgender women than there are trans people, that our experiences don't matter. We have to focus on cisgender women. Once we solve that problem, then we can get to you. And that's a really harmful narrative because, one, the rates by percentage there are a lot more trans people experiencing sexual violence than cisgender women. That is not to negate the experience of cisgender women. We can and absolutely should be talking about that. But saying that trans experiences don't matter because cisgender women are experiencing it is really harmful. Also, prevention education. So I have seen so many prevention education curriculums and workshops and things like that that really reinforce cisnormativity and these very sort of outdated ideals of gender and gender roles. And so it reinforces that narrative that sexual violence is a cisgender man perpetrating violence against a cisgender woman, which is, again, a very harmful narrative because it erases trans people. It also is very reductive about the experiences that cisgender women face in experiencing sexual violence. There are cisgender women who experience violence by other women. There are cisgender men who experience sexual violence from other cisgender men or cisgender women. So having that narrative and having that cisnormativity within prevention frameworks is really harmful and doesn't do anything to actually prevent violence. It is putting a Band-Aid on a very specific kind of violence and ignoring everything else. And what I've seen a lot of prevention educators and curriculums do as a way to sort of attempt to counteract that is that they'll just start using gender neutral language everywhere. And so they may have a scenario talking about a sexual assault and sort of encourage attendees to think about what they could do to intervene and things like that and help understand what is happening and what sexual violence looks like. But they won't use unique pronouns and they'll just stick in some gender neutral names like Alex and Taylor or whatever and say, we are now being inclusive because we're being gender neutral. But gender neutral does not mean inclusive. Because the way we experience sexual violence, and I say we meaning all people who experience sexual violence, not just trans people, is inherently influenced by the power dynamics of gender, by how we experience gender. You can't ignore gender in our prevention efforts in a half-hearted attempt to be inclusive. Then in terms of direct services, so in 2016, I did some research where I was interviewing both transgender survivors of both sexual and domestic violence, and also interviewing service providers at rape crisis centers, domestic violence shelters, and other sort of service provider agencies. And every single service provider that I interviewed said, we want to support trans people, but we have no idea how. And that was a common theme that kept coming up with every single interview that I did. And I'll also say that the agencies that agreed to be interviewed by me are the ones that wanted to be inclusive. The ones that didn't care about being inclusive were not going to agree to take part in this kind of research study. So in that way, my data was skewed. So don't think that all service providers want to be inclusive because they aren't necessarily. And also a theme that really came up from that research and that I've also seen since in other agencies is this issue with funding. So even if state and federal funding say that they have to be inclusive of trans people, that they can't discriminate against trans people, there are still private donors out there who say, I don't want to give funding to anything except women's services. And when they say women, they mean cisgender women. And they sort of put that stipulation on their funding. So then agencies, even if they want to be inclusive, are put in this really tricky situation where they have, on one hand, their sort of values of wanting to be inclusive and what state and federal funding and laws may be saying about being inclusive, but then they also have this private donor money saying you can't be inclusive. And when you're a nonprofit or any type of agency serving survivors, turning out money is a really hard thing to do because these agencies are so underfunded to begin with. That is by no means all agencies. I know there are a lot that are doing much better than sort of the ones I was interviewing at the time. And that was also 4 years ago. And I think things have changed a lot since then. But that was a pattern that I saw. And I want to acknowledge that that tension does exist in many cases. And finally, on the research side, there is very little targeted research on trans people experiencing sexual violence. And the research that is more broad about sexual violence in general, it's often very exclusionary. I have so many times gone to fill out a research survey from some researcher studying sexual violence or whatever, and I get to the demographic questions and then ask for sex, and the options are male or female. and doesn't ask anything about gender. And I will immediately just close the window on that survey and not even look at the rest of it. I think this is starting to change in recent years. I'm seeing more and more researchers be more inclusive in that regard, but there's still long ways to go in that way. So all of that's to really highlight that in so many regards, in so many ways, trans people are being erased from the narrative of sexual violence. Another moment to breathe. I'm going to grab another sip of tea. So, okay. Impact of child sexual abuse on the trans community. So what we know. I talked a little bit about sort of broader statistics on sexual violence in the trans community earlier. But what we know about child sexual abuse specifically is very, very, very scarce. In my sort of research, I haven't done primary research on this topic specifically, quantitative research, but in my sort of secondary research, I think I found maybe like 5 to 7-ish studies that in some way tangentially talked about child sexual abuse. Some of them may ask what the earliest age of sexual violence, what age that occurred. And even then it's not always super specific. So the numbers that I have up here are super vague. They're often from very small sample sizes. So to really to highlight that there is so much that we don't know, and why we need more trans people doing this kind of research and more researchers who understand the importance of trans inclusion. And so, for example, one study in Spain that was specifically interviewing transgender survivors of sexual violence found that 87.9% were younger than 13 when they experienced their first incident of sexual violence. And that number is horrifying to me. Granted, this is one singular study in Spain and was specifically interviewing trans survivors. So I by no means want to say that that number is sort of universal or generalizable, but that is just still a horrifying number. Being younger than 13 and experiencing your first form of sexual violence is so deeply traumatic, not only because it is a trauma happening, but also because of where you are developmentally and what the lasting impacts of that can be. And then there's a study in Virginia that found that 27% of respondents experienced unwanted sexual activity, and the median age of first incident was 14 years old. And this study was also one of the only, I think the only study that I found that also talks about frequency of sexual violence. So 26% respondents had 2 incidences, 19% had 3 to 5, 19% had 6 to 19 incidences of sexual violence, and 16% had 20 or more incidents. So again, these numbers are horrifically high, not only of how many people are experiencing sexual violence at a young age, but also re-victimization. And that re-victimization, I think, sort of ties nicely into what I want to talk about here of intersecting forms of trauma. So as I've sort of alluded to, child sexual abuse is by no means the only form of violence that trans survivors of child sexual abuse are experiencing. There are so many other forms of violence that trans folks in general are constantly experiencing. So in order to understand the impact that child sexual abuse has on the trans population, we also have to understand how this violence is compounded by other forms of violence and trauma. So this happens through vicarious trauma. So often the only time trans people are talked about in mainstream media is in the context of trans people experiencing violence. Just in the past few months, I've seen so many headlines of trans people being violently beaten or trans people being murdered, et cetera, et cetera. In general, we don't see headlines of trans people living their best lives. We don't see stories of trans people thriving and succeeding and excelling in life. We only see the narratives of violence, and that creates an immense amount of vicarious trauma for the trans population because we are repeatedly seeing these media stories. There's also very much a form of collective trauma that sort of ties in with the vicarious trauma. When trans people hear story after story of trans people being murdered, there is a trauma response to that. It is scary, and that is particularly compounded for trans people of color, specifically Black and Indigenous trans people. So that collective trauma, again, contributes to how we are experiencing violence, because we are experiencing trauma after trauma. And also larger, just intersecting forms of oppression that increase risk for violence. So particularly in the current context of the uprisings that are happening around the country in response to the violence Black people have been facing in the United States, I think it's so important to also remember that this violence is not new. The media attention to it is new. And so for people of color, this is not just a matter of trauma, the trauma of racism that they're currently experiencing, but also this inherited and intergenerational trauma that has occurred for generations and generations in the United States specifically, but also in many other places throughout the world. We also want to consider that people of color in general are more likely to experience child sexual abuse. So I think it's really critical that we listen to the experiences of Black trans child sexual abuse survivors, so many words, and really center up their voices. A book that I have on my resource slide at the end has this book, Love with Accountability, Digging Up the Roots of Child Sexual Abuse, is a collection of stories of people from the Black diaspora talking about their experiences of child sexual abuse and talking about accountability and healing outside of sort of mainstream Western models of justice and healing. So focus on restorative justice and transformative justice. So I recognize that's for me saying that we need to be centering the voices of Black trans people in the narrative of child sexual abuse, because I'm a white person. So that's kind of hypocritical in many ways. And I recognize that that is a shortcoming of this presentation, and something that I'm going to try to be more intentional about in the future when I do these types of workshops. But so all of this is to say that for trans child sexual abuse survivors, who are then on top of that experiencing all these different kinds of intersecting forms of trauma, re-victimization and re-traumatization are not just common, but almost inevitable. And so that creates an environment where so often we as trans survivors can feel stuck. And what I really want to highlight here is that violence in general does not happen in a vacuum. We are all experiencing, those of us in marginalized community, violence in various ways from various actors, state actors, individuals in our life, etc. And so violence happens in communities. It's not just happening to individuals. So because of that, our healing also has to happen in a communal way. And so my experience with child sexual abuse survivors, that is particularly true because child sexual abuse so deeply affects our attachment as children, our foundational relationships as we're growing up. So that community process absolutely needs to be happening. Our healing cannot happen on an individual level if we're not also including that communal healing and building up the relationships that we need to heal. And that doesn't necessarily mean sort of family of origin, healing those relationships, but just in general, restoring our ability to connect with other humans and get that healing through connection. And that is also very true for trans people because, again, of all these intersecting forms of trauma, trans people experience violence pretty much on the daily in various ways. So we have this very unique experience within our community. So in my mind, trans survivors of child sexual abuse literally cannot heal without some type of community healing also happening. And that community can be whatever community means to them. And that's why I think things like restorative justice can be such a powerful tool because it involves those communities and it involves relationships and it creates space for real accountability. And I think accountability is one of the key tenets of prevention that we so often miss. So, shifting gears slightly, I want to talk about barriers to services. I think a lot of this is true of just trans people in general, trying to seek any type of service, whether that be therapy or advocacy around asexual assault or intimate partner violence or whatever. But it is especially true, I think, for trans survivors of child sexual abuse because there's so much stigma around child sexual abuse. So discrimination. I think oftentimes when people hear discrimination, they think about this very explicit form of discrimination and just being outright denied services or access to business. And that absolutely does happen, and that is absolutely a form of discrimination. And it also happens in a lot more subtle ways through just exclusionary practices or spaces. So, for example, an agency may say that, yes, we absolutely welcome trans people, but then they don't have gender neutral bathrooms available. Their staff aren't trained properly on how to use pronouns. Their intake forms aren't inclusive of gender identity. And all those very subtle forms of discrimination can make accessing services unsafe for a trans person. Lack of training. And when I say lack of training, I don't just mean sort of direct service staff. So not just therapists or advocates or prevention professionals, but literally all staff within an agency or organization. So I'm talking about receptionists or administrative assistants, janitorial staff, if it's any type of inpatient or hospital type setting, kitchen staff. Anyone who a trans person might potentially interact with needs to be trained on how to be inclusive and affirming. And it's not just a one-off training either. You can't just sort of say, we did one training and then stick up a rainbow safe zone sticker and call it good. It's really about ongoing training. It's about holding staff accountable for when they mess up and encouraging accountability processes that are going to not foster resentment. Because I think cancel culture and things like that can often create a sense of resentment and make people feel like, oh, well, I messed up, I can never do this again. Like, we all mess up, we all fall short sometimes, and we need to be approaching accountability in a way that will help us learn and grow from those mistakes. And also thinking about sort of larger messaging and processes and policies that affirm that you're actually committed to create an accessible space for trans people, and also specifically trans child sexual abuse survivors. And so I sort of mentioned exclusionary policies and processes and messagings. So I won't go much more into that. Okay, one thing I will say about that is around messaging. So I think a lot of times people think that, oh, if our agency says we support Black Lives Matter, if we say that we support trans lives, whatever, then we're good to go. But the thing is, if an agency has to say that they support those communities, then chances are they don't actually support those communities in practice. Spaces that truly affirm and validate those experiences and understand how to support those communities are not going to have to sort of justify that with a public statement. I think there is absolutely value in publicly stating it regardless. I mean, sending that public message to help raise awareness and sort of send a message to the larger community. But those of us in marginalized communities will sort of know whether or not that statement is performative, because we are able to tell if you're walking the walk instead of just talking the talk. There's also a huge fear of being outed for many trans folks. So many trans people may feel only safe going to a space specifically geared towards LGBTQ folks, and doing that may inherently out someone seeking services. If someone's targeted because they're trans, they may not want to go to law enforcement or to the hospital for a rape kit or go to trauma therapy because they may feel like they have to talk about being trans as part of that process. So that fear of being outed can be really huge for a lot of people, especially I think in more sort of small town rural areas where there are just fewer people. So word gets around a lot quicker. I went to college in central Pennsylvania. I grew up in South Carolina. I am so aware of how these rural small towns are. So that fear of being outed is exemplified and exponentially grows in those small towns. Revictimization is also huge. And this is true for anyone seeking services for any type of violence or trauma, not just trans folks, because people are afraid that by talking about it, they're going to be re-traumatized. And that absolutely can happen. But for trans folks specifically, there's also the fear of re-traumatization around institutional discrimination and feeling like going into a space where they may have experienced discrimination in the past, there may be a fear of that happening again and re-experiencing that trauma. And even if it doesn't happen again, it can still bring up those memories and feel re-traumatizing. There are also financial limitations. Yes, a lot of agencies specifically working around sexual abuse and sexual violence are often free, but oftentimes those services may not be trans affirming. I know so many trans folks who will not go to any type of mental health clinic or anything like that to seek therapy. They will only see a private practice therapist who is trans because they have had so many bad experiences in larger organizations before. And so they want to be able to build that one-on-one relationship without worrying about the bureaucracy of larger agencies. And private practice, especially in places like New York City, is incredibly expensive. So the financial limitations can be really hindering to a lot of folks. And also feelings of self-blame and shame. And I'm going to talk more about shame on the next slide. But that really boils down to so many trans survivors internalize cis sexism and transphobia and end up feeling like they don't deserve help, that they aren't worthy of healing. And that alone can be a barrier to services. So that leads me to talking about the role of shame in all of this. So often, survivors of child sexual abuse are told to just get over it or just move on or some variation thereof. And that's not because people don't realize how traumatic child sexual abuse is, but it's because we as society don't want to talk about child sexual abuse. There's so much shame and pain surrounding it that society at large would rather just dismiss it and pretend like it doesn't exist than confront it and really talk about these root causes and talk about these experiences. And so that really creates this sense of silence around child sexual abuse. We aren't allowed to talk about it as society. It is so taboo, it is so stigmatized. And that is so often the same message that child sexual abuse survivors get from those who cause us harm. We're told that it's a secret, that we can't talk about it, that our abuser will hurt us if we tell anyone. So often we're told that if we tell someone, then we'll get in trouble. And so this big, huge cone of silence and secrecy and shame is what allows child sexual abuse to exist with the prevalence that it does in our world. And cis sexism and internalized transphobia can also very much lead to feelings of shame around one's trans identity. We get these constant external messages that being trans is wrong, that being trans is something to be ashamed of. And so we are constantly unlearning and fighting against those messages that we receive. And that is exhausting. It is truly a never-ending process. So both of these things combined, both of these different sources of shame, and I say both meaning around child sexual abuse and transness, but they're coming from all different directions in society. And that feeling of shame can so often lead to self-blame for survivors. And so often that also leads to feeling like our transness is what caused our abuse to happen, which can make us feel even more shame about our gender. And it can become this reinforcing cycle of shame and self-blame. And so naming shame, I think, can be such a powerful way to begin to confront these feelings and really break down this cycle of silence. And confronting these feelings of shame, because shame can only exist in silence. So talking about it, and the more we talk about it, the less power it's going to have over us. And so I wanted to talk about shame in this presentation because for trans child sexual abuse survivors, shame comes from so many different places. And like I mentioned before, our individual healing is intertwined with communal healing. So in your role, whether that is a prevention educator, an advocate, an LGBTQ educator, a friend to a trans person, or even if it's for your own healing journey, I believe that we all collectively have a responsibility to begin to talk about this shame, to talk about child sexual abuse in general, but particularly in the trans community, so that these feelings of shame can be confronted in a very radical and public way. And that, in my mind, can be so transformational and serve not only as healing for trans survivors of child sexual abuse, but also be used as a tool of prevention for child sexual abuse in general and sexual violence more at large. So we have to start talking about it. We have to overcome this sense of shame and silence that is so prevalent when you're talking about transness and child sexual abuse and the intersection of those two experiences. Another breather and moment of tea. I never realized how dehydrated I get when I'm talking for so long. So moving on to some practical tips. The clock, I'm hoping we will have some time for questions at the end. And so one of the biggest things that I think people need to acknowledge when trying to be affirming and inclusive of trans people in general and trans survivors of child sexual abuse is institutional harm and distrust. So no agency or organization is going to be innocent from perpetrating institutional harm. That is just a reality of the world that we live in. And so part of being accessible and affirming to trans people is being able to do your own internal work around accountability and equity. So bringing in trans survivors of child sexual abuse before you've done this kind of work can cause a lot of harm and really reinforce past experiences of institutional harm and just continue this cycle of mistrust that so often occurs. I recognize there are a lot of folks at this conference who work in higher education, and doing that in an institution of higher education is very often impossible because there's so much bureaucracy, because there is lack of buy-in from leadership and so many times. So I want to acknowledge and validate that challenge, but also recognize that that doesn't mean you can just give up on these processes of accountability and striving for equity. So at the very least, acknowledging that reality, acknowledging your shortcomings, and validate those potential feelings of institutional distrust that trans survivors might be feeling. And also do what's possible within your office or department. So I know at these big, huge institutions, you may not be able to do a sort of institution-wide truth and reconciliation process. That's just, the vast majority of institutions are not at that place yet. But think on a smaller scale. What can you do as an office, as a department, as a team? I know so many folks in this field work independently as an office, but you can still sort of do that work, get mentorship from people doing really great equity and anti-racism work, doing gender liberation work, all these different things, and get guidance from them. Talk about how you can start that process at a sort of smaller micro level within your institution. So at the direct service level, again, with the narrative of trust, because institutional distrust is so rampant and because trans people have experienced so much institutional harm, that pain and trauma can often translate to one-on-one direct service relationships. So one of my biggest pieces of advice is to not take it personally and be really intentional about validating that and creating space to talk about it and address those power dynamics and see what you can do for the individual to really navigate those power differentials. Be transparent about reporting responsibilities, especially if the survivor is still a minor. Again, I know most folks are working in colleges, but even in colleges, you sometimes may get folks who are 16 or 17, especially if you're like a community college and may have a lot of folks in high school doing college credits and things like that. So being very transparent about reporting responsibilities for whatever your agency or state laws and policies are, be clear about that. By no means am I saying to not follow those, because we have to follow them as mandated reporters, because I imagine most of us are mandated reporters, but we have to be able to acknowledge what those responsibilities are so folks can make informed decisions about what they do and don't want to share. And also talk about sort of levels of care and what you as an individual or as an agency are and aren't able to offer. So many trans survivors of child sexual abuse face incredibly high rates of suicidal ideation and self-harm. And it is, unfortunately, from what I've seen, incredibly common for there to be this transferring of responsibility among service providers. And as a result, there's this constant line of, you need a higher level of care than we can provide, and things to that effect. And I'm a social worker. I understand that it is important that providers not sort of do things that are outside of their competency or outside of their training. But what ends up happening so often is that this is more so used as an excuse, and it ends up being discriminatory against trans survivors. And it's not so much a genuine concern about an individual or an agency level to support. It's about not wanting to deal with it. So a lot of trans survivors have this internalized feeling of being too much for direct service providers. So being able to have a conversation up front about what you are and aren't able to offer, both in terms of your own skills and training and also sort of any agency policies that may exist. So that way, again, trans folks can make informed decisions about what they do and don't want to share, and if your agency or if you as an individual are going to be a good fit. So often, there may not be other options, especially if you're working in the context of higher education and maybe a student doesn't have access to outside support systems. But so with that, acknowledging that there's still things that you can do to help build that trust, even if those barriers are in the way. And I'm not going to sort of go more in depth around that aspect of how to build that trust, because so much of it is individuals, and that's sort of my last point on here, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But most importantly, around trust, recognize that building trust with trans survivors of child sexual abuse may take longer than it would for sort of your quote average client. I don't like using that word, but so you want to be flexible with any type of session limits and things like that, and just be really patient. I know a lot of colleges have a session limit on how many therapy sessions you can get at the counseling center, or a lot of insurance plans may dictate, oh, we'll only cover this many sessions of this particular modality and things like that. So within whatever power you have as a service provider, be flexible with any type of those limitations, because having that extra time to build up that trust can feel really reassuring to trans survivors. Also, not assuming that child sexual abuse is the primary concern. So often service providers hear child sexual abuse and that's a huge red flag, and they automatically assume that that is the main thing that someone wants to talk about. And that is a big misconception. They may not be ready to talk about it. There may be something more recent or more pressing that they want to talk about. They may have already processed it in their space and not want to revisit. There's so many reasons why a trans survivor of child sexual abuse may be seeking therapy or direct services other than the child sexual abuse. So you want to create a space that is affirming for those experiences without forcing them to talk about those experiences, and without sort of assuming that that is the biggest thing that they have experienced and why they're seeking services in the first place. For colleges specifically, one of the biggest shortcomings I see all the time with so many colleges across the country is this, and not just with trans students, with students in general, is this really harmful and false notion that campus sexual assault is the only type of sexual violence that their student population is dealing with. Many college students come in having already experienced sexual violence in the past. And sexual violence that occurs during college doesn't always happen on campus, or in this very limited narrative of going to a frat party and getting drugged and things like that. All this very narrative, narrow views that leadership and administration often has is not the only way that sexual violence is occurring during college. So being accommodating for the type of survivors that you're working with. And I know with the new Title IX regulations, Title IX processes are a lot tighter. That doesn't mean you can't serve students in other ways. You can still support them and make sure that they're getting the help that they need, even if it's not through a formal Title IX process. I feel like I don't need to say this, but I'm still gonna say it. Never allude to any type of victim blaming at all, or in any way insinuating that someone is trans because they were assaulted. Anything along those lines, just avoid it. I imagine most people know that, but I think it's important enough to say again. Do your own education and work around learning and growing on these topics. It is one thing, for example, in a therapeutic setting, when you're getting to know your client, trying to understand their experiences better, to ask them to, for example, elaborate on what their gender identity means to them so that you can better affirm their experiences. But that doesn't mean that you're gonna ask them to give you a trans 101 and explain what gender identity is to begin with. This sort of rule of thumb I like to think of, if the answer to my question is Googleable, then I'm not gonna ask my client that question. I'm gonna go to Google. If it's a question about their own personal experience, and if there is a sort of therapeutic or direct service benefit to me asking it, that's a different story, but nothing that is sort of straightforward textbook you should be asking. I said this before, but treat them as individuals. So often survivors of child sexual abuse and so often trans people are treated as if our experiences are monolithic and that one trans person can speak for all trans people. But the reality is our stories are all unique. All of our identities are unique, and treating all trans survivors of child sexual abuse as this monolithic group is going to cause more harm than good. Okay, I believe this is my last sort of content slide. So when we're talking about prevention, I really sort of like this idea of gender liberation frameworks of prevention. So it's really focused on educating on the power dynamics of gender, sexuality, race, ability, status, etc., and how all of these different dynamics relate to and contribute to sexual violence. And it's, again, like I mentioned before, it's moving beyond these gender neutral scenarios and really focusing on what is happening with these power dynamics and how can we change the narrative of what mainstream society thinks sexual violence is. And part of that is also, from a very young age, consistently challenging cisnormativity and encouraging and normalizing gender exploration. I have a almost 2-year-old niece, and I have already started, through board books and things like that, talking to her about gender creativity and exploring gender. And I think a lot of times when people hear that, there's this innate fear that that's going to somehow cause a child to grow up to be trans, but that's not the case. That child is going to grow up to be more compassionate towards trans people. And if they do grow up to be trans, then great. They will know that they have adults in their lives who love and support them regardless. My biggest thing for prevention in general is anti-oppression is prevention. If you are not doing intentional anti-oppression work with your prevention, then you're not doing prevention work. You are putting a Band-Aid on a much larger issue. And there are a lot of really great people who are doing that kind of work out there already. So I'm happy to serve folks to different resources if they want to talk more about that. But I am running out of time quickly. I want to take a look at some questions. And then finally, for colleges, think about beyond your specific campus and your students' time on your campus. A lot of times, sexual violence prevention on college campuses is focused on the typically 4 years that they have on that campus, and they don't really think about how you're educating students beyond those 4 years and what the implications are going to be outside of the walls of that campus. So it's really about thinking, how can we create a foundational skill set and knowledge base for students in whatever their role may be in preventing sexual violence, because all of us as individuals in society have a role in preventing sexual violence. So for example, a lot of students are going to grow up to become parents. I say grow up. College students are oftentimes already adults, but later in life, they're a lot of times going to become parents. That's just kind of how society often works. Many will not, and that's perfectly fine. But for those who do, are they going to have the knowledge and tools necessary to help prevent child sexual abuse for their future children or current children if they're currently parents? I think student parents is a population that very frequently gets overlooked in these conversations. And working with student parents on sexual violence prevention in college is one of my absolute favorite sort of groups to work with. So yeah, and then last piece of advice, believe trans survivors. I think all of us probably know and have heard narratives of believing survivors and the importance of believing survivors. But I think it's important, particularly important with trans survivors, because so often our experiences are invalidated and erased from sexual violence at large. So there are my references, a couple resources. This is the book that I mentioned earlier, also written on the body, Letters from Trans and Non-Binary Survivors of Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence, is another really great sort of first-hand accounts of these forms of violence. And then Forge and the Anti-Violence Project are two great organizations doing a lot of work around anti-violence among the trans community and also LGBT communities at large. There are a lot more resources that I have, but I don't want to overwhelm folks. So I'm happy to sort of share with folks other resources. If they have questions, feel free to email me. And with that, I'm going to pull up the Q&A. Okay, let's see. Do some or all non-binary people also identify as trans? Some absolutely do. Thank you for asking that question. I forgot to mention that, but yeah, a lot of non-binary people do identify as trans, but not all non-binary people do identify as trans. I saw a Tumblr post where a trans person referred to assisted therapy as I cannot pronounce that word. I'm sorry, I have slight dyslexia. How much does humor work on both sides for understanding common ground? I love this question, and I feel like I could talk for hours about the role of humor in sort of confronting vicarious trauma and violence and hate and all these things. My short, brief answer is going to be, I think humor can play a really important role. I love making jokes about things that are sometimes maybe seen as inappropriate, because I think humor is a way that can unite people. But at the same time, I think it can be a double-edged sword, because that can make people think that joking about these things is okay, and making jokes about it is not okay. Making light of it is not okay. So there's a difference between using humor as a way to find common ground and get over an uncomfortable situation to really talk about it. And then there's another side of it where it can be sort of diminishing. And at the end of the day, that is often going to be sort of an individual response. Yes, someone said I had to unlearn this year not to subconsciously label anyone as AFAB non-binary or AMAB non-binary, because that just, again, categorizes people based on the binary. Thank you so much for bringing that up. That is an incredibly important point to make. I sort of use those terms as a starting point to help people to understand those, because I think before we can unlearn the binaries, we first have to acknowledge the nuances of these binaries. So thank you for bringing that up. I'm just skimming through these to see what questions I can answer quickly. And again, please feel free to email me so I can get to any questions I don't have time to acknowledge. Yeah, someone said, instead of using good touch or bad touch, using the language safe touch or unsafe touch, because good and bad can carry feelings of shame. I really love that. Thank you for bringing that up. Organization good for learning more about sex workers. If I'm remembering the name correctly, it is the Sex Workers Justice Project. I believe that Sex Workers Justice Project. I think it's part of the Urban Justice Center in New York City. I am more than happy to find the exact name if I'm remembering it correctly and email it out if you want to shoot me an email and ask. Thank you so much for all the thank yous. How can research design more inclusive gender questions? Should they include as many identities as possible if multiple choice? Should they allow participants to type the answer in? I have 3 minutes. I could talk for 4 hours about this question. Quick answer, it depends on what your goal of data coding is going to be. I really love the ability to type in a response when possible, but I also know, as someone who's done research before, that can be a nightmare for coding the data and analyzing it. So it really depends on sort of what you're doing. I think there's room for both depending on what you're going to be doing with the data and how you want to analyze it. Someone gave another resource, Read My Lips, Sexual Subversion and the End of Gender. Is this still useful text from your perspective? I have not actually read that, or if I have, it's been a while, so I can't speak to it, but I'm more than happy to sort of look into it again and follow up if you want to shoot me an email.
And I'm so sorry to, I did make it a point to save all of the comments and questions, and I'm sending them over to you in an email right now. I'm sorry to cut you off. I'm personally, professionally sad because I feel like I've just been learning so much. But I wanted to make sure that we had a chance to close out the session and say thank you to you so much. This was an incredible session. Thank you to Dr. Kyan Lynch for joining us today and opening today's session. And thank you to everyone in attendance right now and for participating in SUNY Spectrum. And we do hope to see everyone at 1 o'clock for our next session. And with that, we are going to have to end, but thank you so much. And I hope everyone has a good little break between sessions.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and everyone for coming. This was great.
Thank you so much.